All right, and welcome back to the Mental Health Toolbox. I'm Patrick Martin, your host, and in this episode, I'm going to teach you one coping skill for decreasing your intrusive thoughts, causing you anxiety. And as always, my aim is to teach you actionable coping skills so that you can strengthen your mental health, increase your focus, and succeed at your goals. All right, so let's get started. Okay, just a little disclaimer. As always, the coping skills I cover are derived from my experience as a counselor, but this is for your information and education only. If you need a professional, you should get one. All right, so this is the first coping skill of anxiety I'm going to be covering over a series of different techniques for decreasing anxiety, such as the use of deep breathing, meditation, mindfulness, progressive muscle relaxation, mood tracking, and more, right? We'll just add to the list as we go. But we're going to start this off with a worry journal. And first, I would like to cover with you kind of what a worry journal is, as well as what intrusive thoughts are about, all right? And why it's helpful. Okay, so first we need to talk about how it works, why a worry journal is effective as a coping skill for anxiety, okay? And in order to do that, we have to think about what intrusive thoughts are and how we can make sense out of tracking them down, okay? So let's go ahead and start off by talking about how it works, okay? So in order to understand how a worry journal is effective, first we have to understand the relationship between anxiety and intrusive thoughts. Okay, so when I think of something that is intrusive, I think of something that interrupts my flow, whether I'm doing the dishes or doing the laundry, and if I'm in a conversation, if I'm trying to write or be creative, or even if I'm just talking to someone about something that's important to me. If something interrupts you and disrupts your flow of thought, it's very hard to come back. And I think of intrusive thoughts kind of that way. There's like a fly that just keeps buzzing around and you can't really keep your focus because you have this constant distraction. That's how I think of intrusive thoughts. And they're often about pending issues, future concerns, and we'll get more into that. And the trick is using the worry journal as a way to kind of reel those in and then put some parameters around the thoughts so that they have a respective time to be addressed on your terms, not their terms, okay? So the thing about anxious thoughts is they don't ask for permission. They just butt right in and derail your conversation. And the worst thing I think about anxiety, and in particular anxious thoughts, is they take us out of the present. You know, as adult, it's very hard as it is to be present, right, in the moment. As, you know, children are very good at that. Children can, you know, move in real time, right? They're very conscious of real time. They're not really worried about the future. They're not ruminating about the past. And that's why time moves so slow for children. As we get older, it's much more difficult because we're future tripping. We're worrying about what, 10 things down the road that probably won't even happen. We're worried about what happened yesterday or last year or 10 years ago. And so as adults, we really have to work at being present. And when we have intrusive thoughts, they rob us of the ability to be present. And that really, it affects our quality of life, right? I don't appreciate it, and I'm sure you don't when your attention is taken away from something that's important to you, all right? All right, so let's talk about the definition of intrusive, right? Because really that's what these anxious thoughts are. They're intrusive. The Oxford language defines intrusive as causing disruption or annoyance through being unwelcome or uninvited. And I feel like that definition really nails it, right? It's an uninvited guest. It doesn't ask for permission. It just shows up. And furthermore, anxious thoughts are not just abrupt. They are often unrelated to the context of our situation. They have no context to the circumstance or dialogue that we're presently in, right? Which makes them all the more intrusive because, like I said, they derail us from what's going on in the present moment, and it's much more difficult to come back to that frame of mind once we get pulled away from it. You see, the thing about intrusive thoughts is they hitchhike off of a specific trigger or a thought or a circumstance, and then they hijack our train of thought, attempting to take us onto some kind of roller coaster ride in which we have no real intention of taking. And the thing about anxious thoughts really is that they come on in an instant, and yet they can flavor our entire mood for the day unless we check them, right? They just will put us in a bad space, and they have a way of keeping us in a bad space because anxious thoughts, they piggyback on each other, and it can create this cascade that really puts a damper on our whole day. And it affects our relationships with family and anyone that comes in contact with us when we're in that anxious frame of mind. This is because our anxious thoughts, they play off of our fears. And this happens through the fight or flight response, as you may have heard it, coined in psychology. And that is our natural response to danger, right? To fight or to flee. And what's actually happening is our anxious thoughts are triggering our automatic nervous system to do its job to keep us safe. And whenever we feel triggered or afraid, because our anxious thoughts get us all worked up, then it triggers the sympathetic nervous system and the HPA axis, which will keep us in a state of fear until that fear is resolved. The problem with that is that anxious thoughts or intrusive thoughts in and of themselves don't usually have a resolve. It's just stinking thinking. And we just kind of go in this circular, mental gymnastics trying to find a solution to an ambiguous problem because it's not really defined. We just have these ambiguous concerns, and we will continue to feel anxious until we have some kind of cognitive closure around them. If you would like to learn more about the sympathetic nervous system response or the stress response, check out the show notes or the description, and I'll post some links there for you to do some further reading, okay? And so the stress response would normally serve a good purpose, right? To keep us safe. But unfortunately with anxiety, it has quite a sad effect in that it wastes our energy that could otherwise be spent on meaningful activities with our family, projects, hobbies, our careers, self-care. A lot of wasted energy goes to anxiety when it robs us of being present, right? Okay, so now for the good news, right? I've been talking about all the bad things regarding intrusive thoughts, but the good news is we can actually tap the brakes on our negative thoughts. And we do that through mindfulness activities. You may have heard of guided meditation, forest bathing, deep breathing, mindfulness activities, observing, right? There's all kinds of mindfulness subsets and activities we could talk about. But what I really want you to take from this episode, this video or podcast, is that we can activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is essentially the brakes that start the rest and digest process in our system, whereas the sympathetic nervous system or the stress response is the gas, the parasympathetic nervous system is the brakes, and we can activate that through biofeedback, essentially just telling our brains that, hey, we're safe, there's no danger, or if there was a danger, it's no longer present, now we can relax and be safe. And the adrenaline then stops pumping, and our body starts to send signals to itself that it's okay to relax. So when it comes to treatment for intrusive thoughts, as I had mentioned, there are several options, when we're looking at anxiety or intrusive thoughts. But the worry journal is one I like to start with, and it's derived from cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's not like your typical journal, right, where you would write down your thoughts and your feelings and what happened and how you felt about it and how you interpreted the situation, where it's more of a long form kind of process journal. A worry journal is actually something much more specific. And the idea with a worry journal is that you actually write down verbatim the intrusive thought, right? And if you remember from many of the previous episodes or podcasts you may have listened to that I've put out, I want you to remember that you only have two options when it comes to your thoughts. It's a statement or it's a question. Most negative thoughts that are they're concrete, black and white, skewed, they're often statements, right? And this is important because when you write out your thoughts, you're often going to find that the most distressing ones are statements of worry, statements of fear, and it's important to see that written down so that later on in your worry time, you can actually start to bullet point some of the possible solutions, things you can do to address that specific concern. And it also brings to light the validity of that concern. All right. And the thing about a worry journal is that you don't just keep it in your back pocket and pull it out anytime you're worried. The whole magic behind the worry journal activity is that you have a very specific, blocked out, protected time set aside as like an appointment you put in your day or your week where you're going to sit down and look at your journal and then start to list out the problems that you are concerned about, and then also jot down possible solutions for each concern without any bias, without any judgment. And then what you're going to do is once you have some good ideas down, you're going to then turn around and prioritize those in order of feasibility, and lastly commit to one to try out for the day or the week and see how it goes. If it doesn't work, if it doesn't help to resolve your problem or your concern, then you move on to the next one. And you just go through it in that kind of systematic fashion. But the nice thing about blocking off the time is that it empowers you so that when you have an intrusive thought, you're able to just say to yourself, no, I have a time scheduled for that. I can address this later on during my appointment time. And what that does is it tells your brain that this concern is going to be addressed because it's scheduled, and so the brain can relax about it. The reason people tend to stew on intrusive thoughts is the concern that they're not going to be attended to. But by using a worry journal, then you know it's going to be attended to because you have taken the time to protect it, as opposed to waiting until the only quiet time you get is when your head hits the pillow at night. And guess what happens? Insomnia. Because if that's the only time the brain gets to process your concerns, because life is so noisy and there's constantly things demanding our attention and competing for our attention, then the brain is going to do what it does best when it comes to trying to make sense out of our day and our concerns. But bedtime is not the ideal time for that. So we have to set aside some kind of other quiet reflection time during the day and use that time constructively so that we are attending to our concerns the best we can. And if things can't be addressed, which is the case, some things just don't have any absolute solutions, at least we know, and that'll help, to an extent when there are unaddressable issues, because then we can just choose to focus on what we have control over with what we have with where we are. Okay? Now, when it comes to thoughts in general, I try to think of a conveyor belt, and this is kind of a mindfulness activity. But if you imagine that there's a conveyor belt and your thoughts that come, through your mind are just kind of moving along the conveyor belt, and you get to choose which ones you pick up, take a look at, and if you don't want to attend to that thought, you can put it back down and let it go. The thing about anxiety is there's this propensity to either chase a thought down to try and address it, or there's this impulse to push it away because, hey, I can't deal with this right now, or that's too distressing to think about. And what happens is it only increases the anxiety and the intensity of those thoughts. And so by learning to observe our thoughts and just saying to ourselves, hey, I know where you're from, I know what you're about, but I'm going to choose not to attend to you right now, especially if you already have a worry time. That's a lot easier. You can say, oh no, I'll see you at 2 o'clock, And you can pick up the thought that is more relevant to your present context and need, because what is important is not always urgent. I'm not saying that your intrusive thoughts aren't important to look at, quite the opposite. I'm saying they're so important that they need an appointment, right? To give them that protected time and your undivided attention, but they're not necessarily urgent, and you have to be the one that puts those boundaries in place so they don't disturb you from your other activities of daily living. And, overcoming anxious and intrusive thoughts is a skill, and nobody ever gets perfect at it, but it does get easier with practice. It's like any other habit. We have to exercise that muscle and our response time to those distressing thoughts so that we don't allow them to just run rampant. Yeah? So I'd like to take a minute to just think about why it is that our intrusive thoughts stick. Meaning, why are the distressing thoughts so persistent and it seems so difficult to just make them stop? And that is really due to this idea in psychology that what fires together wires together. Maybe you've heard of that. What fires together wires together. And basically what that means, or where that comes from, is this idea that the brain has these neural pathways, right? And they're connected by neurons and linked by these things called dendrites. And these dendrites are like, if you think about a trail, like if you're walking through the forest and there's like a beaten path, right? You're most likely going to walk down that beaten path. You're not going to take out a machete and carve your own way. And so those beaten paths are like where the neural links are where the dendrites are. It's what your brain is used to following, right? When you're thinking about something or the way that you respond to an idea. And the whole idea of mindfulness or using a worry journal is to start to carve a different path, a different response to triggers and the way that you're thinking or interpreting situations. And over time, it starts to look like a beaten path. But initially, it's a lot of work. And to continue to walk down, and it takes a lot of repeated actions of walking down that trail before it starts to compete with the other way of thinking or the other dendrite path. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, I do post a link to an article in the description. But it's pretty fascinating stuff. But the whole idea is it takes practice to teach your brain to respond differently. But the good news is that there's this notion of neuroplasticity, and your brain can change. You can change your brain. It grows until the day you die. And you get to choose how it forms, right? Through your actual mental and physical responses to stimuli. It's fascinating. But that's where the worry journal comes in. It's a habit and a practice of mindfulness and being intentional and doing things on purpose and for a purpose to change the way your brain responds to stimulus. All right? All right. And the goal with the worry journal then is to just get in the habit of setting up tangible experiments or possible solutions to address your goals. And specifically to challenge your distressing thoughts. And that is done with intention, which actually breeds a sense of adequacy and competency, which is the opposite of the fleeing or avoidance response to triggers. So you're actually taking on more of a proactive role, right? A hero role in your own journey instead of feeling like you always have to flee from your thoughts. You take them head on, but with a practical approach. And the thing about intrusive thoughts is they do seem to follow a pattern and a theme. So the intrusive thoughts that you have might be very different than the intrusive thoughts that I have. But the good news is there tends to be what we call common habits of harmful thinking, all right? Thought habits. And so for one person, it might be labeling. For another person, it might be mind reading. For another person, it might be black and white thinking. For another person, it might be overgeneralizing. For another person, it might be catastrophizing. For another person, it might be negative filtering. And once you figure out what your repetitive, thematic, anxious thoughts are, it's much easier to catch them, right? And that's really at the core of what cognitive behavioral therapy is about. It's getting and paying enough attention to your thought process that you're able to identify the wolf in sheep's clothing, right? The thought that would normally skate by until it's too late, when you're already having an emotional response, you catch it quickly, and then you put it in its place, and you challenge it, and then you do something about it. And you find out if that's not a valid, rational thought, then you get to turn around and replace it with something that's more accurate, balanced, and complete, right? A more well-rounded thought or interpretation, right? And that's where the worry journal comes in. It's a way to kind of check and balance your thoughts. If you're interested in getting a list of what those common harmful thoughts might look like, feel free to jump over to the description or to the show notes, and I have a mood scale handout there if you want to grab it, and it does list a lot of those common habits of harmful thinking if you're interested, okay? All right, and I'll just take a minute to talk about why it works. We've already touched on that a little bit, but the reason the worry journal works is because it really brings to light the validity or invalidity of your thoughts. And because we're not really trained to think about our thinking, it does take some time to get used to, but it is a life skill that you'll carry with you wherever you go, and will hands down improve your quality of life in your relationships, your stress response in the workplace, as you're able to stop, pause, and think about your reactions and your interpretations before you make any judgments about them, okay? And kind of like I said before, the anxiety does stem from anticipated negative outcomes that haven't even happened yet. Once we start to unpack those concerns, we start to see how irrational, or at least untimely, they probably are, right? Because that hasn't happened yet. And really the reason that our brain tries to chase down these thoughts, even though we know it's probably not a great idea at the moment, when it's impromptu, is because we have this desire for cognitive closure. There's a fear that if we leave this thought alone, then it's not going to be addressed, and then our worst fear will come to life, right? And that's why the worry journal is effective, because again, it reminds us that it's going to be addressed. We've made time for it. It's not going to be ignored, right? And therefore, we don't need to worry about our fears coming to fruition. And again, I would just like to touch again on why the worry journal is also effective for improving your sleep. If anxious thoughts are a problem that you have, is because our impulse is either to chase our thoughts down or push them away. But if the only quiet time that we have is at night when we're trying to sleep, that's when our brain is going to try and process them. So again, the whole idea with the worry journal is to have a protected time so that you aren't trying to do these mental gymnastics when you're supposed to be sleeping and resting, right? All right. Now I would like to talk to you a little bit about, just briefly, why the worry journal sometimes does not work when it's not efficacious. And that's when it doesn't apply to this type of anxiety. See, the worry journal is effective for a general type of anxiety, but there are many forms of anxiety, and they have their own best practice, right? Or best intervention, evidence-based practice. And whereas cognitive behavioral therapy would be one evidence-based practice, it covers different areas. There's CBT focused on trauma, PTSD, substance use, OCD, but the interventions within that model might be different, right? And so if somebody has intrusive thoughts because it's related to post-traumatic stress disorder, their worry journal may not be as effective as biofeedback activities and grounding activities, mindfulness, brain spotting, EMDR, those other activities that might be more suited to that specific kind of anxiety. Another example would be phobias, right? Phobias are better treated, right, by exposure therapy or habituation. And we'll be covering that in a different episode. And so the worry journal is really effective when it comes to general anxiety. But if there's another form of anxiety that's more specific, then there might be another coping skill that's better suited. All right, now it's time to put it to practice. And so the first thing, right, step one, is to figure out what kind of journal you're going to use. Are you a pen and paper kind of guy or gal, and that works best for you, then have a dedicated notebook that you're going to use as your worry journal. Now, there are worry journals that are produced just for that. In fact, there's one by Tiny Buddha that I'll link to in the description if you want to check that out. You can grab it right there in Amazon, and then it's got little prompts and food for thought. And that's more of a dedicated journal. It's pretty cheap, and you get it, and then you can just have a dedicated worry journal. And sometimes that's easier if you just have something that's kind of already packaged for you. There's also the phone, right? Phone notes. I'm a big fan of Google Keep Notes, so I'm more prone to use something like that, where I can label stuff. And you could also use your phone calendar, right? Sometimes I encourage clients, well, you've already got your phone in front of you and your calendar, so you could always just, use the notes inside the calendar. That's usually more effective for mood tracking, though. But you do you. You do what works for you. If you're a pen and paper, get the Tiny Buddha journal or just a pen and paper notebook. Just the important thing is that you're committing to a time. The second thing is to schedule it, right? Schedule a protected time, whether that's, half an hour a day, a 2-hour block during the week, and that you are then making sure that you keep that time protected and committed. And then the third thing that you really want to do here in terms of the homework is making sure that you are listing possible solutions to your concerns without bias, without judgment. You're just brainstorming possible solutions, and once you have a good amount, then you're going to start to prioritize them in terms of feasibility, right? And then experiment, right? You experiment, you try them on, and you don't give up. If the first 5 things aren't helping, then you move on to the next and the next. And eventually what will happen is you'll whittle down your solutions to healthy coping skills. Because like I said before, the thoughts that are causing you distress are not new, and they will repeat themselves. And once you figure out what works, guess what? You can rinse and repeat. And then over time, your reaction time will get faster and faster at catching your thoughts and then implementing the coping skills that work. And so I'm not going to say that you're ever going to decrease or eliminate your anxious thoughts. That wouldn't be practical. But you can certainly get faster at catching them and improve your recovery time once they impact you, right? Okay, so there you have it. Another tool for your toolbox. Please let me know if you have tried using a worry journal before. Let me know in the comments. If not, try it out. Let me know how it goes and any roadblocks that you might be experiencing or any success as well. I would like to hear from you. All right. Thank you so much. Until next time, keep thriving. Go make good things happen. Bye-bye.